I'd been hiking the Cohutta Wilderness for 3 days when I lost the trail, and I want you to understand right at the start that I was the kind of young man who thought getting lost was a thing that happened to other people. I had a topographic map in a waterproof sleeve, a silver compass I'd owned since high school, a GPS unit my father had given me before I left, and the cocky certainty that comes with being 26 and having all your knees still work. I was 4 days into what was supposed to be a 6-day solo loop through the northern Georgia wilderness, the deep folds of the Cohutta, where the old growth still stands in patches, and the streams run cold enough to ache your teeth. My pack was heavy, and my legs were good, and I felt, that morning, like a man who had figured out how to be alone in the woods without being afraid of them. That feeling lasted until somewhere past the second creek crossing, when I realized the blue blazes on the trees had simply stopped. I don't mean they grew sparse. I mean they ended. I walked back 50 yards and found the last one. Faded blue paint on a yellow birch, dripping down the bark like it had been applied in the rain. The next one should have been within sight up the trail. It wasn't. I walked forward another 100 yards. Nothing. The trail itself, that narrow, worn ribbon of dirt I'd been following all morning, faded out under leaf litter and roots, until I couldn't honestly tell anymore whether I was on it or beside it. I pulled out my compass and watched the needle drift in a slow, lazy circle, settle, drift again, settle in a different direction. I tapped it against my palm. It did the same thing. I dug out my GPS, and the screen showed me at coordinates that didn't match anything on my paper map. In a section of forest, the map said, didn't exist between two ridgelines that did. I sat down on a fallen log and tried not to panic, because panic is what kills you out there. Every search and rescue man will tell you the same thing. I drank some water. I ate a piece of jerky. I told myself out loud that I had food for 3 more days, and that I would simply walk downhill until I hit a creek, and follow the creek until I hit a road. People had been doing it that way for 1,000 years. That's when the light changed. I'd been sitting maybe 10 minutes, and when I looked up, the afternoon sun that had been cutting clean shafts through the canopy was just gone. Not clouded over. Gone. The light under the trees had taken on the color of weak tea, of something steeped too long, and the shadows had gotten strange. Too soft, with no clear direction. I stood up and looked for the sun and couldn't find it. The canopy above me was the same canopy it had been an hour earlier, but the light passing through it had changed its mind about what time of day it was. I told myself it was just thick cloud cover I couldn't see through the leaves. I told myself a lot of things in those next few minutes. And then I smelled the smoke. It wasn't wood smoke. I want to be clear about that, because I grew up around wood smoke. My grandfather heated his cabin with a Vermont casting stove from the day I was born until the day they put him in the ground, and I know what hickory smells like, and oak and pine. This was sweeter, almost floral, but underneath the sweetness was something medicinal, something that made the back of my throat tighten the way it does. Around hospital cleaning solutions. It came on the air from somewhere south of me, faint but steady, and I did the thing that I have spent the last 11 years, wishing I had not done. I followed it. I told myself smoke meant people, and people meant rescue, and I was lost and stupid and 26 years old, and I picked up my pack and started walking toward it. The smell got stronger as I went. The forest got quieter. I don't think I noticed at the time how the birds had stopped, but I notice it now, in memory, the way you notice a clock that has stopped ticking only after it stops. The brush thinned out ahead of me, and through the trees I caught the flicker of something pale. And then I stepped through a wall of mountain laurel into the clearing. It was a circle. A perfect circle, the way no natural clearing in the woods has ever been. Maybe 40 feet across, the grass inside it grown low, and even like it had been kept that way, and at the center was a fire pit built of river stones stacked in a careful round. 7 flat stones, each about the size of a serving platter, were arranged around the pit at equal distances. The ashes in the pit were gray and feathery, but when I knelt and held my hand over them, I could feel the heat coming up off of them. Hours old at the most, maybe less, and hanging from the lower branches of the trees that ringed the clearing were bones, small bones, mostly, vertebrae, and what looked like jawbones, and the long thin bones of bird wings, all of them tied with twine the color of dried blood and hung at different heights so they spun slow in the air. Except there was no air. I want you to understand that part. The leaves on the trees above me were not moving. The grass at my feet was not moving. The afternoon was as still as a held breath. But the bones turned slowly on their twine, all of them, each at its own pace, and the sound they made was the softest dry clicking, like teeth, like the ticking of 100 small clocks. I should have left. I have replayed this moment 10,000 times since, and in every version of the replay, that is where I turn around and walk back the way I came. But in the actual version, the real one, the one I have to live with, I crouched down beside the nearest of the 7 flat stones, because I saw a corner of something white poking out from under it, and I picked the stone up. Underneath was a photograph. It was a photograph of me. It had been taken 3 days earlier, at the trailhead parking lot off Forest Service Road 64, where I had locked my truck and shouldered my pack and started walking. I was standing next to my truck in the picture, adjusting a strap on my shoulder, looking off to the right at something out of frame. The lighting was the early morning lighting of that exact morning. I remembered the t-shirt I was wearing in the picture because it was the shirt currently in the bottom of my pack, packed away because I had sweated through it on the first day. I had been alone in that parking lot. There had been no other cars. I had checked twice, the way you do when you're about to walk into the woods by yourself for a week. My hands were shaking when I turned the photograph over. On the back of it, in something dark and dried and flaking off in places, someone had written my mother's maiden name. And under that, the date of my birth. And under that, in smaller letters, the hour. 3:47 in the morning. I have never known anyone outside my immediate family who knows the hour I was born. My mother only told me once, when I was a child, and she told me because I had asked. I was still kneeling there, holding the photograph when I realized. The woods around the clearing were not empty. I cannot tell you exactly when I realized it. There was no snapping of twigs, no movement at the edges of my vision. It was more that the silence around me changed its texture, became a populated silence, the way a dark room feels different when there is another person standing in it with you. I lifted my head very slowly and looked at the trees on the far side of the clearing, and I could not see anyone, but I could hear them breathing, all of them. Maybe a dozen separate breaths in the brush between the trees behind me too, breathing in slow, steady unison like one organism. In and out, the same rhythm. And then someone began to hum. It was a woman's voice, I think, or a high man's. It came from somewhere behind me and to the left, and it carried a tune I half remembered from a long time ago. A hymn, one of the old ones, one of those mountain hymns my grandmother used to sing when she did the dishes, the kind that sound mournful even when the words are about salvation. I could not place the title. I could only feel the shape of it, the way you feel the shape of a song you knew in childhood. The humming went on, and as it went on, another voice picked it up. somewhere in the brush to my right, and then a third, behind me. They were not singing together. They were singing in a round, the way children sing, row, row, row your boat, overlapping. Each voice a few beats behind the one before it. The hymn went around the clearing in a slow circle, and I was at the center of it, still kneeling, still holding the photograph of myself. I dropped the photograph and I ran. I want to be honest about the running. There was no plan to it. I went the wrong direction on purpose, because the way I had come in was where most of the breathing had been. And so I crashed through the laurel on the opposite side of the clearing and just kept going. The brush tore at my arms, and my pack snagged on every branch, and I lost my hat somewhere in the first 100 yards. I do not remember most of that running. I remember the sound of my own breath, ragged and panicked, and I remember that for a long time the humming followed me, faint and patient, getting no closer and no farther, just a steady accompaniment somewhere off in the trees. And then, sometime after the light started failing, the humming stopped, and the woods got quiet again, and I was alone. I do not know how I survived those next 2 nights. I remember some of it in pieces. I remember curling up against the base of a beech tree and not sleeping. I remember drinking from a creek with my hands because I could not remember where my water bottle had gone. I remember talking to my mother out loud at one point, apologizing to her for something, I cannot remember what. The rangers found me on the morning of the 3rd day, 2 ridges over from where my truck was parked, sitting in the middle of a logging road with my boots off and my feet bleeding. They told me later that I had been hard to talk to for the first few hours, that I kept repeating things that did not make sense. When I was lucid enough to give a statement, I described the clearing to them. The circle, the 7 flat stones, the fire pit, the bones in the trees. I gave them coordinates from memory, the best I could, and 3 different rangers went out over the following week and walked that area thoroughly. They found nothing, no clearing, no fire pit, no stones. They told me, gently, the way you talk to someone who has been through something, that disorientation and dehydration could do strange things to the mind, that what I had experienced was real to me, but was probably not real in the way I thought it was. I wanted to believe them. I have spent a lot of years trying to believe them. But there is one more thing. When my mother finally got to the hospital, she was crying, and she told me she had been so frightened because every night I had been missing, her phone had rung at 3:47 in the morning, every night, the same time. And on the other end of the line had been my voice, my own voice, very faint, calling her by the name only her mother had ever called her, asking her to come and get me. She had the call log to prove it. The number was mine. The phone in my pocket, when they found me, had been dead for 4 days, and where they found me had no cellular service of any kind. And I had not, in any of the ways a person can call their mother, called my mother. I have never asked her what my voice sounded like on those calls. I do not want to know. I do not want to know if it sounded scared or if it sounded like it was smiling. My Uncle Clayton ran about 40 head of cattle on a piece of land that had been in our family since before the Civil War, a long, crooked finger of pasture and pine that snaked along the bottom of a hollow outside Whitesburg, Kentucky. The back of his property butted up against the Daniel Boone National Forest, miles and miles of it, ridges folding into ridges, all the way to the Tennessee line. And the summer I turned 19, he called my mother and asked if she could spare me for a few months. He needed somebody to walk the back fences for breaks, he said. Somebody young and cheap with 2 good legs. My mother, who had not spoken to her brother in 7 years over, something neither of them would explain to me, told me on the phone that I did not have to go. She said it twice. Then she said if I did go, I was not to wander past the back fence under any circumstances, and I was to come straight home if Clayton started acting strange. I thought it was an odd thing to say at the time. I packed a duffel bag and rode a Greyhound down to Hazard, and Clayton picked me up in his old Ford in a t-shirt that smelled like cattle and bourbon, and he hugged me hard, and I did not think anything else of what my mother had said for a long while. The work was easy. The way summer farm work is easy when you are 19 and your body still belongs to you. I would walk the perimeter of his property every morning and every evening, 3 miles each way, looking for places where the cattle had pushed through the barbed wire or where a tree had come down across the fence line. I carried fence pliers and a coil of wire and a canteen, and Clayton's old blue heeler Bess would come with me sometimes, panting and weaving through the high grass. The back third of the property ran along the edge of a hollow that the people in town called by a name I will not write down here. I asked Clayton about it on my second night over fried potatoes and pork chops at his kitchen table, and he set his fork down and looked at me for a long moment and said, "We were not going to discuss the hollow at the supper table or in the house at all, and I was not to ask anyone in town about it either." He said it pleasantly enough, but there was an edge under the pleasantness, and I noticed for the first time that there was salt scattered along the windowsill behind him and along the sill of the kitchen door, and that the same salt lay in a thin line across the threshold of every room I had been in. On my fourth evening, walking the far stretch of fence with the sun already going down behind the ridge, I noticed that Bess had not come with me. She had stopped at the edge of the back pasture, sat down on her haunches, and watched me walk away. I called her once, and she did not move. I called her again, and she lowered her head onto her paws and would not look at me. I went on alone because I was 19, and a dog's mood was not going to change my evening. The light by then was the long copper light of a Kentucky July, the kind of light that turns everything the color of an old penny, and the shadows under the trees on the forest side of the fence were already pooling deep and blue. I saw the deer skull from maybe 40 yards off. It was mounted on what I took to be a young sapling about chest height, just past the fence line on the Forest Service side. A whitetail buck, 4 points to a side, the bone bleached, almost luminous in the failing light. I thought at first that some hunter had stuck it there as a marker, the way men sometimes do, and I walked closer because I had never seen one displayed quite that way. As I got closer, I saw that the eye sockets were not empty. Something white had been packed into them, 2 pale wads of it, filling the hollows where the eyes would have been. I thought it was cloth, cotton batting, maybe, or torn-up rag. I was maybe 10 feet from it when one of the wads of cloth blinked. I want to describe to you what that felt like, because it is the moment in my life I keep coming back to, the moment I separate everything that happened before from everything that has happened since. It was not a fast blink. It was slow and deliberate, a lid coming down and lifting back up the way a person blinks when they are very tired or very patient. And after the blink, I could see, in the depth of that eye socket, the wet shine of a real eye looking back at me. And then I understood that what I had taken for a sapling was not a sapling at all. The trunk of it was too pale. The branches were the wrong shape. As I stood there frozen, my whole body refusing to process what my eyes were telling it, the shape resolved itself into a person. A very tall, very thin person, standing perfectly still, with their arms at their sides, wearing the deer skull over their face like a mask. Their skin was the color of bark in the dim light, or perhaps painted that color. I could not tell. They were naked from what I could see, or close to it, and they were so still that even now I do not know how I had not seen them clearly from farther away. They did not move. I did not move. I do not know how long we stood there, looking at each other through the empty eyes of a dead deer. It might have been 10 seconds. It might have been a minute. My mind was not working in any way I could measure, and the only sound was my own breathing, which had gone very shallow and very quick. Then I heard the antlers. It came from somewhere behind the figure, deeper in the trees. A soft, hard sound, the talk of bone striking bone, two pieces of antler being clicked together in a pattern. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 3 taps again. And then, from farther back and to the left, an answer. 3 taps, 2 taps, 3 taps. And then from somewhere behind me and to the right, on my side of the fence, another answer in the same rhythm. They were calling to each other across the hollow, and one of them was already on the pasture side of the fence with me, somewhere I could not see. I did not run. I want to be clear about that, because every part of my body wanted to run, and I have wondered since whether running would have ended it right there. But something old and animal in me knew that running was the wrong thing, that running was what they wanted, that whatever this was had patterns it had practiced, and a runner was inside those patterns. So I walked backward, one step, then another, very slowly, keeping my eyes on the figure with the deer skull. And the figure with the deer skull turned its head slowly to track me as I went. It did not move its feet. It only turned its head, the long bare neck rotating with a smoothness that was not quite right, until I had backed up far enough that the angle should have made it impossible to keep watching me. It kept watching me anyway. The clicking continued in the trees, 3 and 2 and 3, 3 and 2 and 3. And as I backed up the half-mile to where I had left Bess, the clicking followed me at a distance, never closing, never falling behind, matching me step for step. Bess was where I had left her, still flat on her belly in the grass. And when I reached her, she got up and ran for the house, without waiting for me, her tail tucked so tight I could not see it. I followed her at a fast walk, not looking back. And the clicking stopped sometime around, when I crossed the second pasture, though I could not tell you exactly where. Clayton was on the porch when I came up the drive. He had a cigarette in one hand and a coffee mug in the other. And he looked at my face and stood up and said, "Do not say it. Do not say what you saw, not out loud, not in the house, not anywhere on this property until I tell you." He said it quietly. "The way you talk to a child you are trying not to scare." I followed him inside. He set his coffee down and went to the gun cabinet and took down a pump-action shotgun and a box of slugs, and he loaded the shotgun at the kitchen table without speaking. Then he got a canister of rock salt down from a cabinet and went room by room, laying a fresh line of it across every threshold, thickening the lines that were already there. He had me follow him with the canister. He did not explain. When we were done, he walked me down the cellar stairs and showed me a folding cot, already made up with a quilt and a pillow, like he had been expecting me to use it. And he told me I was to sleep down there tonight, and not come up no matter what I heard. He set the shotgun on the kitchen table, on his way back up, and shut the cellar door behind me. I heard him drag something heavy across the floor and set it against the door. A chair, I think, maybe the icebox. I did not sleep. I sat on the cot with the quilt pulled around my shoulders, and I listened. For a long time the house was quiet, just the ordinary settling of old wood, and then around 2 in the morning, I heard the first sound from outside. A clicking, in the yard, near the kitchen window. 3 taps, 2 taps, 3 taps. And then, from the other side of the house, an answer. They circled the house for what felt like an hour. They did not try the doors, they did not try the windows. They only walked and clicked, And once, just once, I heard a voice in the yard, a single word in a language I did not know, and then the night went quiet again. In the morning, Clayton came down the cellar stairs and told me I was going home. He drove me to the bus station in Hazard before breakfast, paid for my ticket in cash from a roll of bills he kept in the glove box, and on the drive, he told me the only piece of family history I have ever gotten from him. He said his daddy had warned him about the deer-faced ones when he was a boy. He said they lived back in the hollow and had always lived there, and that the families who owned the bordering land had an arrangement with them that went back generations, an arrangement that involved leaving certain things at certain times in certain places. He said it was not a religious thing exactly. He said it was more like paying a tax. He said he had stopped paying his portion 3 winters back after his wife died because he had decided he did not believe in it anymore and could not afford the foolishness. He said he had been wrong about that and that he was going to set it right, and that I was not to come back to Kentucky for any reason until he called and told me it was settled. He never called. He died in October of that same year. The official cause of death on the certificate was heart failure, and he was 61 years old and a heavy smoker. So on paper, there was nothing to question. My mother flew down to make the arrangements, and I went with her. The funeral director was an old man named Mr. Pell, who had known Clayton since they were boys. And on the second day, when my mother stepped out to take a phone call, Mr. Pell took me aside and said he needed to tell me something that he would deny if I ever brought it up later. He said that when they had received Clayton's body from the county coroner, there had been something placed inside his mouth that had not been put there by any doctor or any first responder. He would not tell me what it was. He only said it was something old and something small and something he had seen once before in his career on a body brought down out of the same hollow 40 years ago. He said he had removed it himself before the family viewing and burned it in the furnace behind the funeral home, and he hoped I would understand why. I told him I did. I have not been back to Whitesburg since. My mother sold the property to a timber company, and the timber company sold it to someone else, and as far as I know, the cattle are gone, and the house is gone, and the back fence is gone, and the hollow behind it is just the hollow it has always been. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is right, I will hear something on the roof of my house here in Ohio that sounds for all the world like the soft hard talk of bone striking bone. 3 taps, and 2 taps, and 3 taps again, and I will lie in my bed, and I will not get up to look, because some part of me already knows what I would see if I did, and some part of me has known since the summer I was 19 that whatever was owed in that hollow did not stop being owed when my uncle died. I worked seasonal trail maintenance for the United States Forest Service for 11 years, mostly in the Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina, and in all that time, the trail I walked more than any other was a stretch called Pine Hollow. It was nothing special on a map. 3.5 miles of old logging road turned footpath, running from a gravel pullout off the parkway, down through a saddle between 2 ridges, and out into a watershed creek the locals fished for brook trout. Easy grade, good drainage, the kind of trail a maintenance crew gets handed first because it does not punish you. By the autumn I am telling you about, I had walked Pine Hollow somewhere on the order of 40 times. I knew every switchback. I knew which water bar needed rebuilding every spring. I knew the big yellow poplar at the Second Creek crossing that the kids carved their names into, and I knew which sections you could lose phone signal on, and which sections you could still pick up the country station out of Asheville if you stood in the right spot. I am telling you all this so that you understand. I was not a man who startled easily on that trail, and that what happened to me, there is not a thing I can attribute to nerves or to unfamiliarity with the ground. It was the second week of October, and we had a downed pine across the trail. About 2 miles in, a 40-footer that had come down in a windstorm 3 nights earlier. My supervisor, Dale, had wanted it cleared before the weekend because a Boy Scout troop was coming through on Saturday, and the chainsaw work was going to take most of an afternoon. I had drawn the short straw because nobody else wanted to give up a Friday, and I had told Dale I would just stay late and finish it. That evening, work past sunset if I had to, claim the overtime, drive home in the dark. He had been fine with it. He had told me to radio in when I left the trailhead. I started cutting around 4. The light under the canopy in October goes early, and by 5:30 I was working by headlamp, bucking the pine into rounds I could roll off the trail one at a time. It was good, clean work. The saw was running well. The cuts were going through clean. The air had that cold, sweet smell that October has in those mountains, leaf mold and wood smoke from somebody's cabin miles away. I was not thinking about anything in particular. I was thinking about getting home and eating the leftover chili my wife had put in the fridge before she went to bed. I was about 3/4 of the way through the trunk when I shut the saw off to change the chain, and in the silence after the engine wound down, I heard them. It was singing. That was the first thing my mind told me, and it was correct. But the word singing does not really do justice to what I was hearing. It was 4 or 5 voices, maybe more, layered together in a kind of harmony that did not quite move the way modern harmonies move. The intervals were strange. The notes leaned against each other in ways that made my back teeth ache. It was a hymn, or it was the shape of a hymn, slow and patient and full of long-held vowels, and the words, when I could make out the words at all, were not English. They were not Spanish either, or German, or any other language I have ever heard a word of. The closest I can come to describing them is to say that the words sounded like English, with all the consonants softened and rearranged, like English being remembered by someone who had only ever heard it through water. I went very still. The voices were coming from somewhere off-trail, downhill, and to my right, maybe 200 yards through the trees. I could not see anything from where I stood, but I could see, through the gaps in the trunks, a soft moving orange glow. Candlelight, a line of it, drifting slowly between the trees, the way a procession moves. Not flashlights, not lanterns. The unsteady warm light of actual flame. And as it moved, I could count the separate sources of it, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. And I think 6, though I was never sure of the 6th. I want to tell you what I did next, and I want you to understand that it was not bravery. I killed my headlamp. I did it slowly, with the back of my wrist, so that no motion would catch any eye that might be turned my way. The forest went black around me, except for that drifting orange line, and I crouched down behind the rounds of pine I had been cutting, and I made myself as small as I could. My chainsaw was still warm beside me. The smell of 2-stroke exhaust hung in the air. I remember thinking very clearly that if they had not heard the saw running 5 minutes earlier, then they had been farther away then than they were now, and they were coming closer. The procession moved along a line below me, parallel to the trail but maybe 50 yards downslope, where there was no path that I had ever known about. I watched them pass. They were robed in something pale, off-white or cream, or the color of unbleached muslin in candlelight, long garments that fell past their feet and dragged on the leaf litter. They wore hoods pulled forward over their heads. I could not see any of their faces. I tried. I leaned forward as much as I dared, and I strained my eyes at every passing figure, and each one of them kept their head bowed at just the right angle that the hood swallowed everything above the chin. They walked in loose single file, not perfectly spaced, the way real people walk when they have walked together for a long time. And each of them was carrying something. The bundles were held close against the chest, cradled in both arms, the way a person carries an infant. They were the right size for infants. They were wrapped in the same pale cloth as the robes, and most of them were perfectly still in the carrier's arms. But one of them, the third or fourth in the line, I could not tell, was moving, not struggling, just shifting, slow and small, the way a sleeping baby shifts when it is dreaming. The carrier of that one was humming. I could hear it separately from the larger song. A low, private hum, the way a mother hums to a child that is half asleep. I have not stopped hearing it since. I held my breath for as long as I could, and then I let it out as quietly as I could manage, and then I held it again. They were passing slowly. There must have been 6 of them, possibly 7. The song carried on without faltering, the strange overlapping harmonies of it, filling the hollow, and I realized at some point that the singing was not coming only from the people I could see. There were other voices, further off, deeper in the woods, joining in at intervals from places where there were no candles. I do not know how many singers there were in total. I am glad I did not see the rest of them. The last figure in the procession stopped walking. They stopped about 10 yards from where I was crouched. Just stopped in the middle of their step, and the candle in their hands stopped moving too, hanging perfectly still in the dark. Their head tilted to one side. Not the curious tilt of a person who has heard something, the deliberate tilt of a bird that is listening for a small animal in tall grass. The hood stayed forward. I could not see a face. I could see the very faintest edge of a jaw inside the hood, the line of it lit from below by the candle, and the jaw was wrong. I cannot tell you exactly how it was wrong. The proportions of it, something about the angle where it met the neck. I closed my eyes. I think I closed my eyes. I did not want to keep looking, and I did not dare look away. The figure stood there for a count I will not pretend to know. It might have been 10 seconds. It might have been a full minute. The humming of the one carrying the moving bundle continued the whole time, soft and steady. And then the standing figure straightened its head, lifted its candle, and resumed walking after the others. The song moved on through the trees, and the candlelight moved with it, drifting down the hollow toward the creek and away, and I waited there in the dark behind my pile of pine rounds until I could no longer hear any sound at all from that direction. I did not finish the cutting. I packed up my saw with hands that would not stop shaking, and I walked the 2 miles back to my truck without my headlamp on, navigating by the faint sky glow between the trees, falling twice on the way out. And I did not turn the lamp on until I was inside the truck with the doors locked. I drove home without radioing in. I told my wife I had finished the work and gone to a diner on the way home, and she did not ask me anything else because I was not behaving in a way that invited questions. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my recliner in the living room with all the lights on and waited for sunrise. In the morning, I drove to the ranger station, and I told Dale what I had seen. I told him slowly, and I left nothing out. He listened without interrupting, which was not like him. And when I was finished, he sat behind his desk, with his hands folded on the blotter for a long moment, and then he asked me what the date had been the night before. I told him, October 12th. He pulled a filing cabinet drawer open, and he took out a folder so old the edges were going soft, and he opened it on the desk between us. There were incident reports in it, typed and handwritten, going back decades. He turned through them slowly. The top one was from 2014, October 12th. A maintenance worker had reported a procession of robed figures on Pine Hollow Trail at approximately 7 in the evening. The report had been filed, and no follow-up investigation had been conducted. The next report was from 2007, October 12th. A solo hiker had been treated for shock at the trailhead after fleeing what she described as a candlelit funeral in the woods. The one before that was 2000. The one before that was 1993. The one before that was 1986. The handwriting changed as we went back through the decades, and the typewriter fonts changed, and the paper yellowed, and the dates did not. October 12th. Always October 12th, always Pine Hollow Trail, always around the same hour. The oldest report in the folder was handwritten in pencil on a piece of Forest Service letterhead from 1958, and the wording was almost identical to my own. A procession, robed figures, a hymn in a tongue the writer did not recognize. Bundles carried like infants. Dale closed the folder. He told me to take the rest of the week off with pay. He told me not to work that section of trail again alone, and not at night, ever. He told me that the file I had just seen did not officially exist, and that I would oblige him by not mentioning it to the seasonal hires. I said I would. I went home. I quit the Forest Service 2 months later. I gave Dale my notice in person, and he shook my hand and did not try to talk me out of it, and I think we both understood why. I have done other work since. I am a man now in his middle 50s, and I have a wife and grown daughters and a house that is paid for, and a life that, by any honest measure, is a good one. But sometimes, when I am working in the garage or driving alone on a long stretch of road, I will catch myself humming a tune. It is slow and patient, and full of long-held vowels, and it does not sound like any song that has ever been on the radio. My wife has heard me hum it 3 or 4 times over the years. She has asked me twice where I learned it. I have told her both times that I do not remember. That is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I do remember, and that I am afraid of what it might mean that I have not forgotten, and that I am more afraid still of what it might mean that every October, as the nights get cold, the tune comes back to me a little more easily than it did the year before. I had been on the Appalachian Trail for 9 days. When I came down out of the high country of Mount Rogers, and by then I was the particular kind of tired that long-distance hikers will recognize, the kind that has settled into your bones and become the natural state of your body. I was 28 years old, and I was attempting to hike the Virginia section as a vacation from a job I would quit 2 months later, and I had a plan worked out for that 9th day that involved leaving the official trail and taking an old logging road down to a gravel county route where a friend was supposed to pick me up the following morning. It was a shortcut of maybe 4 miles that would save me a long ridge walk in deteriorating weather, and the logging road was on my map, faintly, in the dotted lines they use for routes that may or may not still exist on the ground. I checked with another hiker that morning, an older man going southbound, and he said yes, the road was still walkable, that he had used it himself 2 years before, and that it ended at a crossroad with the county route, where there was a small turnout I could camp at if I needed to. I left the trail around 3 in the afternoon. The logging road was easier to find than I had feared, an obvious break in the trees, with the old wheel ruts still grooved into the ground under decades of leaf fall, and the walking was easy for the first 1.5 miles. Downhill at a gentle grade, the kind of grade a logging truck could have handled when this was still a working road. The light under the trees was already starting to go thin by the time I had gone 2 miles. The forest there was mostly oak and hickory, the trunks tall and bare for the first 30 feet, and the leaves coming down on me steady and slow on a faint wind that smelled of rain not yet fallen. I was thinking about dinner. I was thinking about whether I had enough fuel left in my stove canister. I was thinking, I remember, about a woman I had been seeing back home in Charlottesville and whether she would still be willing to see me when I got off the trail. Ordinary thoughts. The thoughts of a man who has no particular reason to be afraid. The road came around a slow bend, and ahead of me, maybe 200 yards down at the place where the gravel of the county route ran crossways, I could see the crossroad. I could see the turnout the southbound hiker had mentioned, and I could see, standing in the middle of the junction, 4 people. I slowed without meaning to. There was nothing immediately wrong about them at that distance. It was a family, plainly. A man, a woman, 2 children. They were just standing there at the crossroad, in the open, where 4 roads, or what had once been 4 roads, came together. And they were facing the direction I was coming from. As I got closer, I could see them better, and what I noticed first was the clothes. The man was wearing a brown suit, a full 3-piece, with a vest, the kind of suit my grandfather had worn for funerals when I was very small. It was cut wrong for any decade I could place precisely, the lapels too narrow, the trouser legs too high above the shoes. The woman beside him was in a long dress of dark calico, brown and faded yellow, that fell almost to her ankles, with a small white collar at the throat. Her hair was pulled back tight. The boy, maybe 10 years old, was in a wool jacket and short trousers and high stiff socks. The girl, maybe 7, was in a dress that matched her mother's, only smaller, and her hair was in 2 long braids tied off with what looked like twine. They were not dressed for hiking. They were not dressed for picnicking. They were dressed the way a family in a black and white photograph from 1910 would be dressed. And they were standing in the middle of a gravel road at dusk, in shoes that were polished, on a stretch of Forest Service land, miles from any house. None of them were carrying anything. No baskets, no bags. The man had no hat in his hand. The children had nothing. They were just standing there, all 4 of them, side by side, facing me, and as I came closer, I realized that they were not talking to each other. They were not shifting their weight. They were not doing any of the small movements that people do when they are standing somewhere, waiting. They were perfectly still, and they were watching me. I have walked up on enough strangers, on enough trails, to know what the normal range of human behavior looks like in those situations. There is a moment of mutual notice, an adjustment, sometimes a wave, sometimes a polite hello, sometimes a slight stepping aside. None of that was happening here. The closer I got, the more obvious it became that they had been waiting for me. Their eyes did not leave my face. The man's were a pale, washed-out blue. The woman's were dark. I could not see the children's eyes clearly yet, but I could see that they were already fixed on me from 100 yards out, the way the eyes of animals lock onto something they are tracking. I was about 40 yards from the crossroad when I raised my hand to wave. I did it almost without thinking. It was the reflex of every hiker, the small acknowledgement you give to other human beings on a quiet trail, and I lifted my right hand in a loose wave at about shoulder height. The man raised his right hand. Same height, same angle, same loose set of the fingers. He did it perhaps half a heartbeat after I did, like a delay, like a reflection in a slow mirror. He did not wave the hand. He just held it up where I had held mine. And then, a half beat after him, the woman raised hers in the exact same gesture, and then the boy, and then the girl. They went up in order, one after another, each one slightly behind the one before it, and they all held the gesture there, 4 pale hands raised in the gray light at the end of a gravel road, watching me. I stopped walking. I lowered my hand slowly. The man lowered his, the same delay, the same angle going down. Then the woman, then the boy, then the girl. All 4 hands fell at the same speed, in the same order, and the only sound on the whole stretch of road was the wind in the dry leaves over my head. I want to tell you what I felt right then, because it was not what I would have expected to feel. It was not screaming fear. It was a deep, cold recognition. A small voice inside my chest, somewhere behind my breastbone, said very clearly that I was not looking at 4 people, that I was looking at something else that was using the shape of 4 people, badly, on the outside of a body that did not quite remember how 4 people stand together in a road at dusk. The voice was calm. It told me to leave. It told me to leave now, without speaking, without smiling, without showing them anything else about how I moved. I took 1 step backward. Just 1. A small testing step, the way you test ice on a pond. All 4 of them took a step forward, at the same moment, the same length of step. I want to be careful in how I describe what happened next, because I have told this story a few times in my life, and the temptation is always to make it dramatic. The truth is quieter than dramatic, and worse. I turned around and I ran. I ran the way you run when you are not thinking. When the body has decided what to do without consulting the mind, and I went back up that logging road at full speed with my 40-pound pack pounding against my back, and I did not look behind me, not once, because some animal part of me knew that looking behind me was exactly what they were waiting for me to do. I do not know what they did when I turned and ran. I do not know if they followed me. I do not know if they ran too, or if they walked very slowly, or if they only stood in the road and watched my back receding. I only know that, for the first half-mile, I could hear something behind me, a sound that might have been footsteps in leaves, and might have been my own pulse hammering in my ears, and that I did not stop until full dark had fallen, and I had put what I estimated to be 2 miles between myself and the crossroad. I spent that night in a hollow, under a rock shelf, about 30 yards off the logging road, in the kind of hiding place a man chooses when he is no longer thinking about comfort. I did not set up my tent. I did not light my stove. I ate a granola bar and drank cold water, and I sat against the back wall of the rock shelf with my pocket knife open in my hand, and my pack between my body and the opening. I did not sleep. The forest that night made all the ordinary sounds it makes, the small rustlings of mice and the occasional far-off cry of some bird, and twice I thought I heard footsteps somewhere on the ridge above me, but I could not be sure, and nothing came near me, and somewhere around 4 in the morning, I think I closed my eyes for a little while. In the gray light before sunrise, I climbed out of the hollow, and I hiked back up to the main trail, and I walked north on the AT for the entire day, without stopping for more than water, and I got myself to a road crossing where I could call my friend and tell him to come pick me up at a different location entirely. I never went back down that logging road. I have not been back to that section of Mount Rogers in the 15 years since. 2 days later, when I had eaten a real meal and slept in a real bed, and could trust my own voice not to shake, I drove to the ranger station nearest to where the logging road came out. I did it because I felt obligated to. I do not know what I thought a ranger could do. I just felt that what had happened to me should be on a piece of paper somewhere. The woman behind the counter was older, maybe 70, gray-haired and small, and she listened to my story without interrupting. I described the family. I described the clothes. I described the wave and the mirrored gesture and the step forward When I stepped back, I described all of it. When I was finished, she did not speak for a long moment. She had gone pale while I was talking, a slow draining of color from her face that I had not noticed at the time, but that I noticed now. And her hands on the counter had gone very still. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and careful, and her question was not the question I had expected. She asked me whether I had accepted anything from them. She asked it just like that. Had I accepted anything? Food, water, a coin, anything that had been offered. Anything I had taken from a hand. I told her no. I told her they had not offered me anything. I told her I had not gotten close enough to be offered anything. I told her the only thing they had given me was the mirror of my own wave. She nodded slowly. She let out a breath I had not known she was holding. She said, "Good," she said. "The ones who accept do not come back the same." She said some of them do not come back at all. She said she had taken a report like mine, perhaps 4 or 5 times in her career, and that the families who took the offers were the families who later got phone calls from sheriffs in 3 counties asking if anyone had seen their husband or their daughter or their grown son, and that the families whose hikers had refused. The offer usually got their hikers back, eventually, more or less the way they had sent them out. She did not tell me what the family at the crossroad was. She did not tell me whether anyone had ever seen them by daylight, or whether anyone had ever found the road they came down. She only said that I had done the right thing without knowing it, and that I should not, under any circumstances, ever take that logging road again, and that if I told this story to other people, I should be careful about telling it in October. Because the telling of it, she said, sometimes brought the thing told about a little closer to the door. I have told the story a few times since. I have told it now, in a month that is not October, in a place that is not Virginia, to whoever is listening to my voice. But I will tell you that I have noticed, in the years since that evening, that I have developed a small habit I did not have before, which is that whenever I pass a stranger on a road or on a sidewalk and they raise a hand to wave at me, I find that I no longer wave back. I cannot bring myself to do it. I nod instead, or I say good morning. I do not raise my hand. I do not know exactly what I am afraid of. I only know that since I walked up that logging road, in the failing light of an October evening 15 years ago, the simple gesture of a stranger waving has stopped feeling like a friendly thing and has started feeling like the beginning of something I would not be able to take back. My name does not matter for the purposes of this story, but my profession does, because it is the reason I was where I was. I have spent the last 16 years writing and updating guidebooks for long-distance hikers, the kind of small fat paperbacks you find in the back of an outfitter's store with mileage charts and water source notes and the locations of shelters and good campsites. It is not glamorous work, but it is honest work, and it has taken me into most of the wild places on the eastern seaboard, and I have walked more miles in the Appalachian mountains than I have walked anywhere else in my life. The summer this happened, I was scouting a proposed reroute of a section of the AT in southwestern Virginia, a stretch where the original trail had been damaged by a series of bad storms, and where the Trail Association was considering moving the path a half-mile north to follow a higher ridgeline that was supposed to drain better. My job was to walk both the old route and the proposed new route, record water sources, look for camping options, and assess the general condition of the ground. I had a backpack, a GPS unit, a paper map, a notebook, and a small digital camera. I was alone, the way I usually am for this work, and I was not expecting to find anything that would change my professional life. But I did. I noticed the first mark on the morning of my second day on the proposed reroute. I was walking through a stand of mature oaks, big trees, 2 and 3 feet across at the base, the kind of forest that has not been cut in 100 years, when something on the bark of one of the larger trunks caught my eye. I stopped and looked at it. It was a carving, but it was not a blaze. Trailblazes are simple, 2 colors of paint, 6 inches by 2 inches, regulation issued. This was something else. 3 vertical lines, parallel, each about 6 inches long, cut deep into the bark with what must have been a wide-bladed knife. A horizontal line crossed all 3 about 2/3 of the way up, and below the crossed lines, a spiral, going inward, perhaps the size of a man's palm. The whole mark was at chest height. The cuts were old enough that the bark had begun to heal around them, but not so old that the lines had been swallowed up, and the wood inside the cuts was darker than the surrounding wood, the color of old tea, as though something had been rubbed into them once and then left to dry. I stood looking at that first mark for a long time. I thought maybe it was a hunter's territorial sign. I thought maybe it was the work of some kid who had been camping back here. I took out my notebook and I sketched it, and then I took a photograph with my camera, and then I walked on. I found the second one within an hour, on another oak, perhaps 300 yards farther along the proposed route. Same mark, 3 vertical lines, 1 horizontal, the spiral beneath, same depth of cut, same dark interior to the wood, and like the first one, it was carved on the side of the tree, facing inward, toward something on my left as I walked. I stopped again. I sketched it again. I took another photograph. By the end of that day, I had found 9 of the marks. They were on the big trees only, never on saplings or young growth, and they were always at chest height, and they were always facing the same general direction, inward, toward some center that lay off to the side of my proposed route. I began to map them on my GPS, dropping a waypoint at each one, and that night in my tent, by headlamp, I pulled up the waypoints on the small screen and looked at the shape they made. They made an arc, the beginning of an arc anyway, suggesting a much larger curve. I sat in my tent with the unit in my hand and felt something I had not felt in many years of doing this work, which was the cold pricking sensation at the back of my neck that meant my body had decided to be afraid of something before my mind had caught up. I should have left the next morning. I have thought about that decision many times since. What I did instead the next morning was leave the proposed route and walk inward, toward the center of the curve my waypoints had begun to suggest, in order to confirm what shape I was looking at. I found more marks as I went. The pattern resolved itself on my screen as I walked, the way a constellation resolves itself when you look long enough at a patch of sky. And by midday it had become a rough oval, perhaps a quarter-mile across at its longest, with the marked trees forming a boundary all the way around. I was inside the oval. I had been inside it since I had stepped off the proposed route, and as I had crossed the boundary line, something had changed about the forest. Though I could not say at first what, it was the sound, or rather, the absence of it. The forest had gone quiet. Not the natural quiet of a still morning, oppressed quiet. A quiet that had weight. There were no birds calling. There were no insects in the undergrowth. There was no rustle of squirrel in the leaf litter. The air did not move. The whole stand of trees inside that oval had been emptied of every small living thing that should have been making noise, and what remained was a silence that pressed against the inside of my ears, the way the silence presses on you in a soundproofed room. I stopped walking and I listened, and I could hear my own heartbeat. I could hear the small sound of my pack settling on my shoulders when I shifted my weight. There was nothing else. I should have left then. I am telling you what I should have done in order to be honest with you. What I did was keep walking. The clearing was at the center. I came on it as the light was going long and golden through the trees, the way the light goes in the Appalachians in late summer, and the clearing was not large, perhaps 30 feet across, and it was almost perfectly round. The ground inside it was clear of leaf litter, swept clean somehow, the bare earth showing in a way that bare earth does not show in an undisturbed forest. At the center of the clearing was a low mound of dirt, perhaps 3 feet high, and 6 feet across at the base, the rough size and shape of a grave. The earth of the mound was a darker color than the earth around it, and it had been recently turned, recently enough, that the surface still showed the marks of whatever tool had been used to pat it down smooth. Driven into the mound, all the way around its base, were antlers, not whole skulls, just the antlers, sawed off or broken off, close to where they would have met the bone, and driven into the earth points down, so that the bases stuck up out of the dirt like the tops of fence posts. There were maybe 20 of them. They were all different sizes, from the small forked antlers of young deer to the wide heavy racks of mature bucks, and they had all been arranged with care, evenly spaced, all at the same height, so that the mound was ringed by them in a precise circle. On the top of the mound, laid out across the dark soil, were objects: a child's shoe, a small leather Oxford, dirty but intact, the laces still tied, a wedding ring, plain gold, a man's ring, sitting by itself on a patch of bare earth, a wallet, brown leather, worn, lying open. I did not touch it. I did not look inside it. A handkerchief, white cotton, folded into a neat square, the corners aligned, a wristwatch. The face turned up to the sky. The second hand was moving. It was still ticking. I want you to understand that I checked, that I bent close enough to be sure, that the watch on top of that mound in the middle of the woods was still keeping time. There were other things: a pair of eyeglasses with cracked lenses, a small silver crucifix on a broken chain, a photograph turned face down, the back of it brown with age, a house key on a plain ring. I counted 12 objects in total. They had been arranged in a careful pattern across the surface of the mound, and the word that came into my mind, unbidden and without my having reached for it, was offerings. These were offerings. I took photographs. I do not know how long I stood there with my camera, walking around the perimeter of the clearing and shooting from different angles, but the light was distinctly redder when I lowered the camera than it had been when I raised it. And I knew that I had to leave. I had no business being there. The silence pressed at my ears. The watch ticked. I turned and walked out of the clearing the way I had come in, and I did not look back. My GPS failed before I had gone 100 yards. The screen went blank. I tapped it. I cycled the power. The unit would not turn back on. I took out my compass, and the needle would not settle, drifting slowly clockwise like the second hand of a watch, never stopping. I stood in the woods and looked at the dead screen and the spinning needle, and I felt a kind of fear that was very calm, the calm fear of an animal that has finally understood the shape of the trap it is in. I closed the GPS into my pack. I closed the compass. I navigated by the slope of the land, walking always downhill, knowing that downhill in those mountains will eventually bring you to a creek, and that a creek will eventually bring you to a road, and I got lucky. I came out on the proposed route just before full dark, and I walked the rest of the way to my truck by headlamp, and I drove home that night without stopping. I downloaded the photographs the next morning. Every single image of the mound was destroyed, not deleted, corrupted. When I clicked on any picture I had taken inside the clearing, the screen filled with static gray and white and black snow, with no recoverable image underneath. There were 23 such files. Every one of them was the same. But the photographs of the marked trees, all of them, taken outside the boundary of the oval, came through clean and clear, and I could zoom in on each carving and study the cuts and the spirals as long as I wanted to. I called a friend that afternoon. Her name is Dr. Margaret Vance, and she teaches folklore at a university in North Carolina, and we had been friends since college. I sent her 3 of the photographs of the marked trees, and I sent her the GPS coordinates of the clearing. I told her what I had seen. She did not respond for several hours. She called me at 9 that night. Her voice was tight in a way I had never heard it before. She did not say hello. She said my name once, and then she said, "Please listen to me carefully." She said, "I need you to delete every photograph and every coordinate from your computer and your phone and any backups you have made." She said, "I need you to promise me you will never go back to that section of forest, for any reason." She said, "I cannot tell you everything I know about what you found, because some of what I know is not the kind of thing I am willing to put into a phone call. But I can tell you the most important thing, which is that the marks on those trees are a boundary, and the boundary means the place is occupied, and the occupants of such places do not appreciate visitors." I asked her what she meant by occupied. I asked her by what. She did not answer me directly. What she said instead, in the same tight, careful voice, was that the act of crossing the boundary registers, that the place keeps a kind of count, that the people who go in and come back out are not strangers to it afterward. She said I had been counted. She said that was the word for it. In the older accounts she had read, the word the people who knew about such places used. To be counted, she said it did not necessarily mean anything bad would happen to me. She said it only meant that I was known to the place now, and that the place was known to me, and that the two of us would have a relationship for the rest of my life, whether I wanted one or not. I deleted the files. I deleted the coordinates. I never wrote about that section of forest in any guidebook. The proposed reroute of the trail was eventually approved on a different alignment, and the original route was repaired, and as far as I know, no official trail of any kind now passes within 2 miles of the oval I walked into that summer. But Margaret was right about one thing, and I want to end on this, so that you will understand what she meant when she used the word counted. In the 11 years since I walked out of that clearing, certain small things have happened in my life that I cannot fully explain. I have lost things, house keys mostly, but also a wedding ring once briefly, and a wristwatch that had belonged to my father. They have gone missing from places where they should not have gone missing from. Drawers I had closed, jackets hung in my own closet. Most of them have come back to me eventually, found in odd corners of the house, in places I am certain I had already looked. But 3 things have not come back. A handkerchief my mother gave me, a photograph of my wife and me on our honeymoon, a silver crucifix I wore as a boy. Those 3 things I have not seen in years. I do not know where they are. I do not know what they are doing. I only know that on certain nights, when the wind is up and the house is quiet, I think about a mound of dark earth in the middle of an oval of marked trees, with antlers driven into the ground around it like fence posts, and I wonder whether the mound has gotten a little taller in the years since I saw it, and whether anyone else has been counted since I was, and whether the watch I saw ticking on its surface is still keeping the right time. I had been section hiking the Great Smoky Mountains for 6 days when I came across the children, and I want to set the scene properly for you because the scene matters. It was late October, the 3rd week. That part of autumn in the southern Appalachians, when the bright colors have already gone and the woods have settled into the long, brown stretch before winter. The leaves were almost entirely off the trees, lying inches deep across every part of the trail that did not see direct sun, and the sight lines through the bare trunks were the kind of long sight lines you only get a few weeks of the year, where you can see 200 and 300 yards into the woods on either side of you, where nothing can really hide because there is no leaf cover left to hide behind. I was 41 years old. I had been hiking the Appalachian Trail in sections for the better part of a decade, 2 weeks at a time when I could get away from work, and this was the last section I had left in the South before I would have completed the entire trail in pieces. I had been looking forward to it for 2 years. I was alone, the way I prefer to be on these trips, and I was happy in a quiet way, the way you can be happy when nobody you know is talking at you for days at a time. That morning I had passed a shelter I had originally planned to stay at the night before, and had instead pushed on another 4 miles in the failing light to a different shelter where I had slept badly because of the cold. I had broken camp at first light, and I was making good time, going southbound, and the trail in front of me ran along the contour of a ridge through a stand of old hardwoods, mostly oaks and maples that had been there long before any of us. The morning was very still. There was a fog that had not yet burned off in the hollows below the trail, and the light coming through the bare branches was the gray pre-noon light of late autumn, with no real warmth in it. I remember I was thinking about a cup of coffee I planned to make at the next water source. I remember I was not thinking about anything else. I saw them from a long way off, through the bare trees. Up ahead of me on the trail, a line of small figures was moving in my direction. My first thought was a school group, or maybe a scout troop on a day hike from one of the campgrounds. I have run into kids on the trail before. It is not unusual in that part of the country, especially on weekends. I kept walking at my own pace, and I expected, as I got closer, that I would see the adult leaders, the brightly colored day packs, the water bottles slung on carabiners. I expected the noise. Children on a trail are noisy, even well-behaved children. There is always at least one talking, and there are usually several. I was perhaps 100 yards from them when I realized I was not hearing anything. The morning was still. There was no breeze through the trees. There should have been the sound of voices carrying up the trail toward me. There was nothing. I was close enough now to count them. There were 12 children, walking in single file along the center of the trail, coming toward me at a steady, even pace. I slowed without meaning to. They were spaced exactly evenly. I want to be precise about this because it was the first thing that struck me as wrong before I had even gotten close enough to see their faces clearly. The distance between each child and the next was the same distance, every time, all the way down the line. Maybe 4 feet between each one. None of them was hurrying. None of them was lagging. None was bunched up with the child in front or behind. They were walking like the cars of a slow train. All at the same speed, all keeping their place in line. Children do not walk like that. I have spent enough time around children to know. I got closer. I was perhaps 50 yards from them now, and I could see them in detail. They were children, I am sure of this, the youngest perhaps 5 or 6, and the oldest perhaps 12, of various heights and builds, boys and girls, but they were dressed wrong. Their clothes were not modern clothes. They were not period costumes either, the way reenactors dress up to play at being from another century. They were just clothes, plain clothes, the kind of clothes that a poor mountain family might have made at home. From whatever cloth they had, The boys wore long-sleeved cotton shirts and dark trousers held up with suspenders, and their feet were in either heavy leather boots or, in two cases that I noticed, no shoes at all. The girls wore long dresses, ankle-length, in faded prints, and their hair was braided or pinned back from their faces. None of them wore a coat. It was perhaps 45 degrees that morning. I was hiking in 3 layers, and I was just barely warm. These children were dressed for a summer afternoon 100 years ago, and they were walking through late October woods in clothing that should have left them shivering, and not one of them showed any sign of being cold. They were not carrying anything. This was the second thing I noticed. After the clothes, that did not make sense. No backpacks, no water bottles, no day packs, not even the little canvas bags that some kids on day hikes will carry a snack in. They were walking with their hands at their sides, all 12 of them, except for the last one in line, whose hands were cupped together in front of her, at about waist height, as though she were carrying something delicate. I stepped off the trail. I do not know exactly why I stepped off the trail. There was no danger I could have articulated. I am a grown man, and they were small children, and they were not threatening me in any way. But something in my body had decided, before my mind had decided anything, that I did not want to share the trail with them, and so I stepped to the right and crouched down beside a big maple, about 10 feet off the path, and I waited for them to pass. They came on at the same steady pace. They did not slow down when they got near me. They did not look at me. I want you to understand exactly what I mean by that. The trail at the point where I had stepped off it was perhaps 3 feet wide, and the maple I was crouched beside was no more than 10 feet from the trail, and I was a 6-foot man in a bright orange hiking shirt, plainly visible against the dark trunk of the tree, and as the line of children walked past me, every one of them kept their eyes forward and slightly downward, fixed on the back of the child in front of them, and not one of them turned their head even a single degree in my direction. Not the leader of the line, who had no one in front of him to follow. Not any child in the middle. Not the last child who was carrying something. 12 children passed within 10 feet of me, and not a single pair of eyes registered me, and not a single foot broke stride. They were breathing in unison. This is the detail I have not been able to get out of my head in the 19 years since. They were close enough that I could hear them breathing, and the breath of every one of them was synchronized, in together, out together, same depth, same rhythm, like the breathing of a single very large animal, broken up across 12 smaller bodies. I could hear the small whistle of air through the nose of the smallest child as she passed. I could hear it match exactly the breathing of the older boy. At the head of the line, 3 children ahead of her, the rhythm did not falter. The rhythm did not adjust for the difference in their sizes or the difference in their stride. They simply breathed together, all 12 of them, as they walked. The last child in line was a girl. She was perhaps 7 years old. She had dark hair in 2 braids that fell to the middle of her back, and her dress was pale yellow with small flowers on it, and as she passed me, I could see what she was carrying in her cupped hands. It was a sparrow, a small, brown sparrow, the common kind, the kind that hops around in the leaf litter looking for seeds. It was alive. Its eyes were open. It was lying in her cupped palms on its back, the way a bird lies when it has been stunned by flying into a window, except that it was not stunned. Its eyes were focused. Its head was turned slightly, looking out from her hands, and as the girl walked past me at no more than 10 feet of distance, the sparrow turned its small black eye, and it looked directly at me, not at the trees, not at the sky, at me. It held the look for as long as it took her to take 3 or 4 steps past me. And then she was gone around the next bend of the trail, and the line of children with her, and the woods were still again. I stayed crouched beside that maple for a long time. I could not have told you how long. My legs had gone numb under me, and my hands were shaking, and I sat down properly in the leaves, with my back against the trunk. And I tried to breathe normally, and I could not for a while, because every time I tried to breathe, I would feel myself trying to match a rhythm that was no longer there. And I would have to consciously break it and start over. I sat there until I could trust my legs to hold me, and then I got up, and I went on south down the trail, and I walked the next 4 miles to the next shelter at a much faster pace than I had been walking before. There was a southbound hiker at that shelter, a man maybe 60 years old, eating an early lunch. I waited until I had drunk some water and gotten myself under control, and then I asked him, as casually as I could manage, whether he had seen any kids on the trail that morning. A group of them walking together. He looked at me for a long moment with a piece of jerky halfway to his mouth, and he said no, he had not seen anyone on the trail all morning. He had been moving since first light. He had passed the shelter I was now sitting in 2 hours ago, and the shelter before that, an hour before that. He said the trail had been empty. He said I was the first person he had seen all day. I did not say anything else about it. I thanked him, and I went on. For the rest of that section hike, 3 more days, I checked the trail register at every shelter I passed. The registers are notebooks, kept inside each shelter, where hikers sign their names and the date, and sometimes leave a note. And any group of 12 children with a leader, the kind of group that would have been on a wilderness day trip, would have logged themselves somewhere. There was no such group in any register. I checked the registers going back 2 weeks. There was nothing. I asked one other hiker, a woman northbound, the same question on my last morning, and she gave me the same answer. No kids, no groups, nobody on the trail today. I got home on a Sunday afternoon. I unpacked my gear. I showered. I sat at my kitchen table, and I drank a glass of water. And I picked up my phone and I called my mother, and when she answered, I asked her something that I had not consciously planned to ask, but that had been sitting in the back of my mind for 3 days like a small weight, getting heavier. I asked her about my older sister. I was the youngest of 3. I had a brother 4 years older than me who was alive and well and lived in Tennessee. I had been told my whole life that I had also had an older sister who had died as a child before I was born, and that her name was Ruth, and that my parents did not like to talk about her because the grief had been bad for many years, and the silence was easier than the conversation. I had asked about her perhaps 3 times in my life. I had been given the same short answer each time. She had died young. It had been hard. There were no photographs because my parents had not been in the habit of taking pictures back then. On the phone that afternoon, I asked my mother to tell me about Ruth. There was a long pause. My mother is not a woman who pauses easily on the phone. She likes to talk. The pause stretched out, and then she said, in a voice that was very careful, that yes, of course she remembered Ruth. What did I want to know? I asked her how old Ruth had been when she died. She told me Ruth had been 4 years old. I asked her how old Ruth would have been now, if she had lived. My mother did the math out loud. 43 years old, she said. She would have been 43 this past March. I sat at the kitchen table with the phone against my ear, and I did the math myself. And the math worked out the same, but a different number had been in my head when I dialed. And I asked my mother, even though I was almost certain of the answer, what color hair my sister had had. Dark, my mother said. Like yours, she had worn it in braids. There was a pause, and then my mother said, more quietly, that Ruth had loved birds, that when she had been very small, before she got sick, she used to sit out in the yard for hours and try to coax the sparrows to come close to her, and that sometimes, my mother said, the sparrows actually had. I told my mother that I loved her, and I had to go. I hung up the phone. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time as the light went from afternoon into evening and into night, and I did not turn the lights on. And I have not been back into the Smokies since, and I have not told this story to my mother. And I do not think I ever will, because she is in her 70s now, and she has carried Ruth quietly for a long time, and I do not want to give her something else to carry. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about a line of children, walking down a trail together in the woods, breathing in unison, dressed for another century, and I find myself wondering whether the girl at the end of the line was on her way somewhere, or whether she was already somewhere, or whether the line itself was not a journey at all, but just a slow, patient route past whatever still needs to see them. One face at a time, one person at a time, on certain mornings of certain years, in the brown woods of late October, with a sparrow in her hands and her eyes turned forward. And the question I keep coming back to, the question I have not been able to answer in the 19 years since, is whether she knew me when she walked past me, and whether the look on the sparrow's face when it turned to me was a look that meant hello, or a look that meant goodbye. I have been a photographer for most of my adult life, the kind who never made a living at it, but never stopped doing it either, the kind who keeps 3 cameras in the house and spends his weekends driving back roads, looking for things to shoot. 5 years ago, I started a personal project on rural decay in the central Appalachians, the slow swallowing of human structures by woods that had never really agreed to let them stand in the first place. Old farmhouses going down, tobacco barns leaning out of true, churches with their roofs caved in. I drove a lot of Forest Service roads in those years. I drove a lot of county routes that did not appear on any current map. And in the spring of the year I want to tell you about, I found a 1-room schoolhouse on a gravel turnoff just inside the West Virginia state line, perhaps 1.5 miles off the nearest paved road, surrounded by second-growth oak and a sagging line of wire fence that had not been a fence in 50 years. The schoolhouse was in remarkably good shape for what it was. White clapboard, the paint mostly gone, but the wood underneath still sound. A small belfry on the roof, though the bell was long since taken. A single door in the front. 4 windows down each long side, most of them still glassed. There was no road sign for the place, no historical marker, no plaque. I had only found it because I had taken a wrong turn looking for somewhere else, and I had photographed it twice on that first afternoon, and 3 more times. On a second visit 2 weeks later, in different light, from different angles, walking around the building, but never going inside, because on both of those visits, the door had been firmly shut and locked with a heavy iron padlock that looked older than the door itself. I went back a 3rd time on a Saturday in late September. I went alone. I had told my wife I was driving out to scout some other locations, and I did not mention the schoolhouse specifically because I was not sure I would be photographing it at all on this trip. I just wanted to be near it again. I am trying to be honest with you about that. There was something about the place that had pulled at me. 3 nights running before that drive, I had dreamed about it, without remembering on waking what the dreams had been. I only knew that when I sat down to plan a route for the day, my finger went straight to that gravel turnoff on the map, and I did not really consider any other destination after that. I pulled up in front of the schoolhouse around 4 in the afternoon. The light was already going long. The woods around the building were quieter than I remembered from my earlier visits, but not in any way I could put a finger on. Just a softer kind of quiet, the way the woods get when a front is coming in. I got out of the truck, and I lifted my camera bag onto my shoulder, and I walked up to the building, and I saw, when I was perhaps 15 feet from the front, that the door was standing open. It had not been opened before. Both my previous visits, the door had been locked with that heavy iron padlock, and I had photographed the padlock itself once because it had a beauty to it, a rusted handmade beauty. Now the door was open, not fully. Open by perhaps 1.5 feet, just enough for a person to step through, the way you might leave a door if you had stepped out for a minute and meant to come right back. The padlock was nowhere I could see. The chain that had been threaded through the hasp was gone too. I stood there in the yellowing grass with my camera bag on my shoulder, and I looked at that open door for what felt like a long time. I told myself that vandals had probably broken in, that kids had probably forced the lock and gone in to drink beer and write things on the walls, and that the responsible thing for me to do was to look inside and assess any damage and report it to whoever owned the property, and then to take some photographs while I was at it, because broken into rural buildings made for good shots and were exactly the kind of thing my project was about. That was the reasoning I gave myself. I walked up to the door. I put my hand against the wood and pushed it the rest of the way open. I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was that the floor had been swept. Not the absence of dust kind of swept that an abandoned building might achieve through some accident of airflow. Actually swept. The wide pine floorboards were clear of leaf litter and animal droppings, and the general detritus of decades, and there were faint visible streaks in the grain of the wood where a broom had moved across them. And in the corner by the door, leaning against the wall, was the broom itself. A handmade broom, bound with twine, the head worn down on one side from use. It was not old, it was not new, it was simply there, leaning in the corner of a room nobody had legally entered in 70 years, and the bristles were still slightly bent in the direction it had last been swept. The desks had been moved. There were 12 of them. Small wooden school desks of the old style, with the iron frames and the lifting lid over a storage compartment. The kind that had not been manufactured since before the Second World War. Originally, they would have been arranged in rows, facing the front of the room, where the teacher's desk stood. Now they were arranged in a perfect circle in the middle of the room. All 12 of them, evenly spaced, the seats facing inward toward the center. The arrangement was so precise that the legs of the desks made a near-perfect ring of small indentations in the dust at the floor's edge, where the dust still lived because the broom had not reached it. On each desk, placed dead center on the writing surface, was an object. I am going to tell you what was on each desk, in the order I saw them as I walked slowly around the circle, because I have thought about the order ever since, and I do not know if the order was significant. The first desk had a doll's head on it, porcelain, cracked across the cheek, the eyelashes still painted on, the eyes themselves either closed or missing. I could not tell. The second desk had a jawbone. It was small enough that I told myself then, and later, that it was the jawbone of an animal, a dog perhaps, or a fox, though I have done enough hiking to know that I was lying to myself, because the shape and the size of the teeth were not the shape and size of any animal jawbone I have ever seen. The third desk had a page torn from a Bible, the Book of Numbers, with the verses on tribal genealogies, and someone had circled a single name in pencil. The fourth desk had a photograph of a man I did not recognize. Black and white, perhaps from the 1920s, his face partially scratched out where the eyes would have been. The fifth desk had a child's tooth, a first molar by the look of it, the root still attached, lying on its side in the center of the desktop. The sixth desk had a folded handkerchief. The seventh, a brass house key on a leather thong. The eighth, a small clay pipe with a chip out of the bowl. The ninth, a wedding ring. The 10th, a lock of hair tied with red thread. The 11th, a folded piece of paper that I did not pick up, but that I could see had handwriting on it. The 12th, single silver coin, very old, the face worn smooth. I stopped at the 12th desk, and I made myself breathe. The afternoon light was coming in, low through the 4 west-facing windows, and laying long stripes of yellow across the swept floor. I could hear my own heart in my ears. I could hear the wood of the building creak as something somewhere outside settled in the cooling air. I told myself it was a prank. Some local kids, some occult role-playing game, some art project. I told myself those things in order. None of them stuck. At the front of the room, on the teacher's desk, was a book. It was a ledger. Leather-bound, the leather so dark and so cracked with age that it looked almost black, perhaps 14 inches tall and 10 inches across, lying flat on the desk and open to a page somewhere near the middle. I did not want to go to the front of the room. I want you to understand that I did not want to. But I went, because I had already come this far, and because some part of me needed to know what was in that book. And I walked between 2 of the desks in the circle and crossed the rest of the room to the teacher's desk, and I looked down at the open page. It was a list of names, handwritten in a dozen different hands going back a long time. The ink at the top of the page was brown with age, and the letters were formed in the careful copperplate of the 19th century. Lower down the page, the handwriting changed, became more modern, the ink darker. There were perhaps 300 names on the page. They ran in a single long column down the left side, and beside many of them, in the same hand or different hands, were small notations I did not pause to read. Some of the names had been crossed out with a single horizontal line. Most had not been. The last name on the page was at the bottom, in ink so fresh that the surface of it still had a faint wet sheen in the slanting light. It was my name, my full name, including my middle name, which I do not use, and which does not appear on my driver's license or my credit cards or my professional work, and which only a small number of people in the world have ever known. And the handwriting was a handwriting I recognized. It was the handwriting of my grandmother, who had died in 1991, and who had been the only person in my life who ever wrote my full name out the way it appeared on that page, with the small flourish under the middle name that she had used because she had felt that the middle name was the most important one, because it had been her father's name. I had not seen that flourish in 34 years. And I knew it instantly, the way you know a face you have not seen since childhood. I do not remember walking out of that schoolhouse. I remember the next thing, which was that I was already in my truck and driving fast, too fast for the gravel road, the steering wheel jerking under my hands as the truck took the washboard surface, and I was 12 miles down the paved road toward home before I realized that my camera bag was no longer on my shoulder, and that I had left it inside the building, sitting on the floor beside the teacher's desk, where I must have set it down without remembering when I went to read the ledger. I did not turn around. I drove home. I drank half a glass of whiskey at my kitchen table without my coat off. I told my wife I had not found anything good to shoot. I did not sleep that night. The next morning I called the County Historical Society. I told the woman who answered that I was researching an abandoned schoolhouse on a service road near the state line, and I gave her the approximate location. And I asked her who currently owned the property. She put me on hold. She came back perhaps 3 minutes later. She said the property was state-owned. She said it had been ceded to the state in 1949. She said the records of the original deed were unusual because the entire local congregation that had built and used the schoolhouse, a small independent church that had also used the building for worship on Sundays, had disappeared in a single night in October of 1948. All of them. 43 people, men, women, and children, the entire community that lived on that mountain. No bodies had ever been found. No belongings had been disturbed in their homes. There had simply been 43 people on the mountain on a Saturday night, and on Sunday morning there had been nobody, and the state had eventually taken the land for back taxes after waiting the required number of years for anyone to come forward. She asked me, in a voice that was suddenly very careful, why I was asking. I told her I was working on a photography project. I thanked her. I hung up. I have not gone back to the schoolhouse. That phone call was 11 months ago. I have driven near it twice on other errands, and both times I have turned my truck around, well before the gravel turnoff, and gone home another way. I told my wife some version of the truth, enough that she would not press me, and she has not. The camera bag has continued to be a thing I do not talk about, because some part of me had decided that the camera bag was the price I was paying for whatever I had stumbled into, and that as long as the bag stayed in the schoolhouse, I would also be left alone. Yesterday morning, I went out to get the newspaper from the end of my driveway, and the camera bag was sitting on the boards of my front porch, leaning against the railing in the spot where I usually leave my boots. It is the same bag I left in the schoolhouse 11 months ago. The strap is still attached. The leather has the same scuff on the bottom corner that it had when I bought it. I have not opened it. I do not know what is inside it. It is sitting on my dining room table as I write this, and my wife has asked me twice what it is doing there, and I have told her twice that I will deal with it later. I am writing this because I do not know what else to do. I do not know what is going to happen next. I only know that somewhere on a mountain in West Virginia, there is a ledger with my name at the bottom of a page, written in the hand of a woman who has been in the ground for 34 years, and that someone or something has decided that the time has come for me to receive my camera back. And I cannot stop thinking that the only reason to return a person's property to them is because the person who borrowed it no longer needs it, because they have already gotten everything from it that they meant to get. There is a ridge in Southern Virginia called Devil's Backbone, and you will not find it on the United States Geological Survey maps by that name, because the official name on the maps is something different and more polite. The locals call it what they call it. If you grow up in the small towns on either side of that part of the Blue Ridge, you know the name from the time you are old enough to listen to grown men talk on porches. And you know that the people who grew up there do not camp on that ridge. They do not hunt on that ridge. They do not let their children play anywhere on the slopes of it. They will tell you, if you ask them directly, that it is not a good place. They will not tell you why. That is the consistent thing about it. They will not tell you why. I was 22 years old in the summer I am telling you about. I had just finished my undergraduate degree at a state school in Pennsylvania, and I had given myself the gift of a month of solo backpacking in the southern Appalachians before I had to start the rest of my life. I had a route planned that took me through a long stretch of national forest land in southern Virginia, including a few days on a section of trail that ran along the eastern side of Devil's Backbone. I had heard the name in passing from a gas station attendant the day before, when I had stopped to fill up my truck and ask for directions to the trailhead. He was a man in his 60s, with hands that had clearly worked outside for most of his life. And when I told him where I was headed, he had stopped pumping my gas for a moment and looked at me with an expression I now understand to have been a kind of polite alarm. He had asked me if I planned to camp on the ridge itself. I had said I had not decided yet, but probably if I found a good spot. He had told me not to. He had said it just like that. He had said, "Son, do not camp on the ridge. Stay down in the hollows. The hollows are fine. The ridge is not fine." I had asked him why, in the way young men ask such things, with the half smile that means I am humoring you. He had not smiled back. He had finished pumping my gas, and he had taken my money, and he had said, "You do what you want. But I am telling you what I am telling you, and I would not be telling you if it was not true." I did not listen to him. I want to be honest about that. I was 22, and I had a brand new tent and a graduate degree's worth of confidence in my own judgment. And I thought that the warning was the kind of warning that local men gave to flatlanders for sport. I made camp that evening in a small grassy clearing just below the spine of the ridge, perhaps a quarter-mile down the eastern slope from the actual high point, in a flat spot that was clearly an established campsite. There was a stone fire ring already there. There were the cut stumps of small trees where other campers had cleared brush. I set up my tent. I cooked my dinner over a small stove. I watched the sun go down over the ridges to the west, layer after layer of blue mountains fading into each other the way they do in that part of the country. And I went to sleep around 10 in my sleeping bag with the tent flaps closed against the cool of the night. And I slept without any dreams that I remembered. I woke up at 2 in the morning. I know it was 2 because I checked my watch by the small light of it before I did anything else. An old habit from camping. The first thing you do when you wake up at night is figure out what time it is. The first thing I had noticed, the thing that had woken me up, was the smell of wood smoke. It was strong. Not the lingering smell of my own dead campfire, which I had soaked with water hours earlier, before going to bed, but the live smell of a fire burning somewhere not too far away. The resinous smell of pine and the heavier smell of oak together, the smell of a fire that had been built and tended for a while. The second thing I noticed, lying there in the dark of my tent with my eyes open, was the singing. It was faint. It was very faint at first, and I had to hold my breath to be sure I was actually hearing it. But once I was sure, I could not unhear it. It was a low droning sound, made up of many voices, men's voices and women's voices, braided together in a kind of harmony that was not the harmony of any music I had ever been to, or any church I had ever sat in. There was no melody to it that I could follow. There was a tone, and the tone was being held by many throats at once. And underneath the tone there was a rhythm, a slow pulse that the voices kept together. It was coming from above me, from higher up on the ridge. I lay there in my sleeping bag and listened to it, and I felt the small, cold prickling at the base of my skull that I have come to understand, in the years since, is the body's older intelligence, telling the mind that something is wrong before the mind is willing to admit it. I unzipped my tent. I did it slowly, by inches, because some part of me had already decided that I did not want to make any sudden noise. I leaned out into the cold air of the clearing, and I looked up the slope toward the ridge, and the ridge above me was lit orange. There was a fire up there, a huge fire, not a campfire, something the size of a building throwing light up into the trees and making the silhouettes of the trunks stand out hard and black against the glow. I could see it perhaps a quarter-mile up the slope, at or just over the spine of the ridge, in a place I had not noticed during the day because I had not been looking up. There were figures moving around it. I could see them as silhouettes against the orange light, small at this distance, but unmistakable. Dozens of them, walking in a slow circle around the fire. The singing was the singing of those figures. I understood that immediately, and at the same level of certainty that I understood the smell of the smoke and the time on my watch. I should have stayed in my tent. I have replayed this moment 1,000 times in the 23 years since, the moment when I was leaning out of the tent flap with the cold air on my face and the fire on the ridge above me and the choice still mine to make, and in every replay I stay in the tent. I close the flap. I lie there until morning with my hands over my ears. In the actual version of what happened, I put on my boots, and I picked up my headlamp without turning it on, and I climbed. I climbed quietly. The slope was steep, but the terrain was manageable. Leaf litter and small roots and outcroppings of granite that I used to pull myself up. I went slowly. I went without any light. The orange glow above me was enough to see by once I got close, and the singing kept up the whole time I was climbing, growing louder as I rose, the harmony of it filling the air around me until I could feel it in my chest. I was perhaps 100 yards from the fire when I dropped flat behind a large granite outcropping that jutted up out of the ground at the very edge of the spine, and I lay there on my belly in the leaf litter, and I lifted my head just enough to look over the top of the rock. What I saw, I will describe to you as carefully as I can. The fire was perhaps 20 feet across at its base. It had been built in the open, on a flat stretch of ground at the spine of the ridge, the kind of natural clearing that you sometimes find at the very top of a ridgeline where the soil is too thin for the larger trees. The flames were going up perhaps 15 feet into the air, and the heat coming off of it would have been considerable. But the figures dancing around it did not seem to mind the heat. There were perhaps 40 of them, men and women of various sizes and ages, walking in a slow ring around the fire in a counterclockwise direction. They were dressed in plain dark clothing, the kind of clothing that does not call attention to itself, the kind of clothing you might wear to a funeral if you did not own anything fancy. They were holding hands. The ring was unbroken. They were singing. In the center of the fire, suspended somehow above the flames, was a wooden frame. The frame was perhaps 8 feet tall and built in the rough shape of a human figure, with a vertical post for the spine and 2 horizontal crosspieces for the shoulders and the hips, and short uprights at the top for the head and at the bottom for the legs. It looked like something between a cross and a scarecrow. The wood of it was already burning, and the fire was eating up the structure from the bottom. But the frame itself was holding its shape as it burned, and I could see, inside the frame, against the post, a figure, a person, a body. I cannot tell you with certainty that I am right about this. I can only tell you what my eyes showed me from 100 yards away, on a ridge in southern Virginia, at 2 in the morning, by firelight. There was a person inside the wooden frame. They were tied to the central post, I think, or fastened to it somehow, because they did not fall when the lower parts of the frame burned away. Their head was upright. Their arms were down along their sides. They were not moving. They were not struggling. They were not screaming. They were just there in the center of the frame, in the middle of the fire, as the fire took them, with the same stillness as a person who has been asleep for a very long time and has gotten used to it. I lay behind the outcropping, with my heart making a noise so loud in my ears that I was afraid the dancers would hear it. The singing went on. The ring went on, counterclockwise, around the fire. I do not know how long I watched. I do not know how much of what I saw I am inventing now in the retelling, and how much of it I really saw. I only know that at some point my body began to act without me, and I found myself backing down the slope, on my hands and knees, moving from one piece of cover to the next, going slowly, taking minutes to cover yards, because I had understood by then that the worst thing I could do was attract attention. I made it back to my camp without being seen, as far as I know. I broke down my tent in the dark, by feel, leaving things in the bag in the wrong order, leaving my stove behind, because I could not find it in the leaf litter. I shouldered my pack and I left the clearing with my headlamp on the dimmest setting, and I hiked downhill for the rest of the night, and for most of the next day, and I did not stop hiking until I had reached a paved road that I could follow back to my truck. I did not stay in the area. I drove all the way home to Pennsylvania that same night, and I slept for 16 hours when I got home. And I did not go back to the southern Appalachians for 8 years. I told the story to almost nobody. I tried to convince myself, in the months and years that followed, that I had seen something else, a reenactment of some kind, a historical pageant, some local festival I had not heard of. None of those explanations ever quite fit, because I knew what time of night it had been, and I knew how the figures had moved, and I knew that there had been no road within miles of that ridge where 40 people could have parked the cars they would have driven in on. I told the story for the first time when I was 30 in a bar in Roanoke to a man who had been drinking next to me for an hour. He was older than me, perhaps 50, the kind of weather-cut Virginia man you do not argue with about local matters. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I was finished, he was quiet for a long while, and then he ordered himself another beer, and he ordered me one too. And when the beers came, he said, "My grandfather was part of that." He said it like that, simply, see, the way you would say, "My grandfather worked at the mill." He said the practice did not have a name that he was going to share with me, but that within the families that kept it, they had called it the keeping. He said his grandfather had told him about it when he was a boy, and had made him promise never to speak of it outside of family, and that he was breaking that promise tonight because I had already seen it and there was no putting that back in the box. I asked him if they had been burning a person alive. He shook his head. He said that they only ever burned what was already dead. He said that was important. He said the keeping was old, and the rules of the keeping were strict, and that the figure in the frame was always one who had already passed, who had been kept somewhere cool until the next gathering, and that the burning was the proper way of sending such a one onward. He said it was a kindness, the way they thought about it. He said it had been a kindness for a very long time. I asked him why I should not have been there. He looked at me for a long moment over his beer, and then he said, "The part I have not been able to stop thinking about since." He said that the keeping was not a thing that strangers were supposed to witness, and that there were strict rules about witnesses. He said witnesses counted. He did not explain what he meant by counted. He said I had been very, very lucky that the dancers had not seen me on the rock that night, because if they had, the rest of my life would have looked different in ways I would not have liked. He said the dancers had ways of knowing when they had been seen, and that they would have come looking, and that they would not have stopped looking. He finished his beer. He paid his tab. He left the bar without saying goodbye to me, and I have never seen him again. I am 45 years old now. I have not been back to Devil's Backbone, and I will not go back, and I have never told this story to my wife. But there is one thing I want to leave you with, because it is the part that I have never been able to settle in my own mind. The man in the bar told me that the dancers had not seen me. He said I had been lucky. He believed I had gotten away clean. I believed him for a long time. I do not believe him anymore. Because 3 or 4 times a year, for the last 23 years, I have woken up at exactly 2 in the morning, by my watch, in whatever bed I happen to be in, with the smell of wood smoke in my nose that nobody else in the house can smell, and the faint sound of singing somewhere, just at the edge of my hearing, that goes away the moment I sit up to listen for it. And I have started to wonder, the way you start to wonder about a long-lost thing, only when the years have piled up enough to give you the perspective. Whether being seen and being counted are really the same thing, or whether the dancers, on that ridge, have a slower and more patient way of keeping track of the people who have looked at them, and whether the keeping, in the end, is something that any of us who have ever seen it are ever fully outside of. I was 3 days into a solo trip on the Benton-MacKaye Trail in North Georgia when I came across the woman, and I think it is important that I tell you what kind of 3 days they had been before I describe her, because the days mattered, and the trail mattered, and the weather mattered, and the fact that I had been alone on it for most of those 3 days mattered too. The Benton-MacKaye is the quieter sister of the Appalachian Trail. It runs roughly parallel to the AT for hundreds of miles through some of the wildest country in the eastern United States. But it gets perhaps 1/10 of the foot traffic. You can go a whole day on it without seeing another human being. That is partly why I had chosen it. I was 34 years old, recently divorced, working a job I did not love, and I had taken 2 weeks of vacation that summer, with the express purpose of walking until I could not feel my legs, and seeing as few people as possible while I did it. The first 3 days had given me what I had asked for. I had seen one section hiker on the morning of day 1, and nobody else since. The weather had been hot, hotter than it should have been, for early September, even in Georgia, 90-something every day, with the humidity making the air feel thicker than air should be, and the trail had been hard going in places, with blowdowns from a storm that had come through the week before, and I had been feeling all of my 34 years in my knees by the time I came around the bend in the trail that afternoon, and saw her sitting there. She was on a log about 10 feet off the trail, in a small clear spot where the canopy opened up enough to let some afternoon light through. She was sitting very straight. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was an old woman, perhaps 70, perhaps a little more, with white hair pulled back tight against her skull and gathered at the nape of her neck in a way I had not seen women wear their hair in a long time. She had a face that had been weathered by a great deal of outdoor work, deeply lined around the eyes and the mouth, and she had the small, precise build of a woman who had not eaten very much, but had never gone hungry either. She was dressed in a long gray dress that fell past her ankles, the kind of dress with a high collar and small buttons. All the way down the front and over the dress she wore a heavy gray wool shawl, pulled around her shoulders and crossed at her chest. It was 92 degrees that afternoon. I want you to hold on to that. I had hiked the 4 miles before the bend in a soak-through shirt, with sweat running down the small of my back, with my hat band soaked dark. The woman sitting on the log in her gray wool shawl was not sweating. Her face was dry. There was no dampness at her temples. Her hands in her lap were as composed and still as the hands of a woman sitting in a parlor on a cool October evening. And she did not appear to be hot in any way that I could see. She had no pack. She had no water. She had no walking stick, no bag of any kind. Nothing on the log beside her, nothing at her feet. She was just sitting there, on a log, 10 feet off the trail, 4 miles from the nearest road crossing, and at least 8 miles from anything that could be called a town, dressed for a different century, in clothing that should have been killing her in the heat, and she was waiting. I slowed as I came up to her. I want to say that I almost stopped, but I did not, because something in the back of my head was already speaking up, telling me in a small, clear voice not to stop, to keep walking, to nod politely and keep going. I have learned to listen to that small voice over the years. I did not listen as well as I should have that day. I slowed instead, and as I got closer, she lifted her head and she looked at me and she smiled. It was a beautiful smile in its way. It was the smile of a woman who had been smiling all her life and knew exactly how to do it. The corners of her mouth turned up evenly, and her eyes crinkled at the edges, and her teeth, when they showed, were small and even and clean. There was nothing wrong with the smile. There was nothing wrong with her at all, on the surface of her, and I want you to understand that, because the things that were wrong about that encounter were not wrong on the surface. They were wrong underneath, in the way a perfectly painted door can be wrong if you know that there is nothing behind it. She said, "Good afternoon." Her voice was clear and pleasant and unaccented. She said it was a hot day to be walking. She said she had not seen anyone in some hours, and she was glad of the company. I said good afternoon back to her. I stopped on the trail about 8 feet from her log. I did not step closer. She tilted her head a little to one side, the way a woman might tilt her head when she has thought of a small thing to ask, and she said, "May I ask your name?" That was the moment. I want to slow down here because the moment lasted only a second or two in real time. But it has stretched out in my memory in the years since into something much longer, and the things that happened inside of me in that second or two are the things I have spent the most time trying to understand. The first thing that happened was that I felt a coldness pass through my chest. I cannot describe it any better than that. It was as though something had passed through me, from front to back, a slow cold current that started at my sternum and went out through my spine, and after it passed, I felt very awake, more awake than I had felt all day, the way you feel after you have nearly stepped on a snake. The second thing that happened was that I remembered something. I had not consciously thought of it in 25 years. But I remembered it the way you remember a song from your childhood when the first 3 notes start to play. I remembered my grandfather. I remembered being 6 years old and being out behind his house on the side of a mountain in eastern Kentucky, and walking with him along the property line, and him crouching down to my level and telling me, in his slow, careful voice, that there was one rule I had to always remember when I was on a mountain, no matter where I was, no matter who I was with. He had said, "Do not ever give your true name to a stranger on a mountain." He had said it just like that. I had not known what he meant. I had asked him what he meant, and he had said, "The mountain people can use it," and I had not understood, and he had said, "You do not need to understand right now. You just need to remember the rule." And I had said, "Yes, sir." And we had walked on, and he had died of pancreatic cancer when I was 11. And I had not consciously thought about that conversation since the day it had happened. I thought of it then, on the trail, with the old woman on the log looking up at me with her small, pleasant smile. I said, "My name is John. It is not my name. It has never been my name. It is not even a name in my family. I do not know why I picked John." It was the first name that came into my head, and I gave it to her, and as soon as I had said it, I felt the coldness in my chest ease a little. She looked at me for a long moment. Her smile did not change. The corners of her mouth stayed in exactly the same position, but her eyes changed. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I do not want to overstate it. Her eyes changed in a way that was very small, very subtle, but completely unmistakable. It was as though a door had closed somewhere behind them. The light in them had not gone out exactly. The light had been turned to face a different direction. She was still looking at me, but she was no longer looking out. She was looking somewhere else, somewhere I could not follow. After perhaps 2 seconds, she said, in the same pleasant voice, that John was a good strong name, an old name, a name she had known many fine men by. She said she had not had visitors in a long time. She asked me, with the same small tilt of her head, if I would like to come sit with her a while. She said the log was wide enough for 2. She said she had been hoping someone would stop. I said, "No, ma'am." I said it in the politest voice I could manage, because some part of me was very afraid of giving offense. I said, "No, ma'am. I had miles to make before dark, and I needed to be at the next shelter by sundown." I said I was sorry. I said maybe another time. She nodded slowly. She did not say anything else. She kept looking at me, with her eyes turned somewhere else, behind the door that had closed, and her smile stayed where it had been. And I took 2 steps backward before I turned around, because something in my body did not want her at my back, and then I turned around and I walked on down the trail. I felt her watching me. I felt it for a long time. I do not know how long it was before I could not feel it anymore. But it was longer than the line of sight should have allowed, longer than any reasonable distance, longer than the trail itself stayed straight before bending. I felt it as a small, steady pressure at the base of my skull, and it only let go of me sometime after I had crossed a small creek and started climbing the next rise. I made it to the shelter before sundown. There was one other person there, a man in his late 20s, lean and sun-darkened, with the look of a thru-hiker about him, the kind of man who has been on the trail for months and has lost all his soft edges. We exchanged the usual hiker pleasantries. We cooked our dinners. We sat on the edge of the shelter platform as the light went and the bugs came out, and somewhere in the middle of a conversation about water sources, he asked me, in a voice that he was trying to make casual, but that was not quite casual, whether I had seen an old woman on the trail today. An old woman, sitting on a log, dressed strange. I said yes. I told him I had. He was quiet for a long time after that. He stared at his hands for a while, and then he asked me if I had given her my name. I told him I had given her a name. Not my name, a name. He closed his eyes. He let out a long, slow breath. He said good. He said good. That was good. He said he had given her his, when she had asked him 3 days earlier, because he had been raised polite, and because he had not seen any reason not to. He said he had been having dreams since. He said he did not want to talk about the dreams in any detail, but they were the kind of dreams that woke him up sweating in the middle of the night, and that he could not shake all morning afterward, and they were getting worse, not better, every night since the encounter. He said his compass had started pointing the wrong way around the same time. Not always. Just sometimes, for a few minutes here and there, the needle would settle on a direction that he knew was wrong, and then go back to normal, and then do it again later. He said he'd had decided he was hiking out at the next road crossing and going home. He said he did not believe in things like this. He was not that kind of person, but he was going home anyway. I told him I hoped he felt better. I told him I would think about him. He shook my hand before he went into his sleeping bag. He had a strong grip, but his hand was very cold. I noticed that at the time. I have thought about it since. He was gone in the morning before I woke up. He had left a note in the shelter register saying he was hiking out. He had signed his name. He had written the date. I walked the rest of that day, and the day after, and at the next shelter, I checked the register, the way I had been doing the whole trip, and I saw his name from his entry 2 shelters back, and the name had been crossed out, not by him. The handwriting of the crossing out was not his handwriting. It was a different hand entirely, a thin, spidery hand, the kind of handwriting you do not see anymore, the kind your grandmother might have learned in a country schoolhouse. There was a single horizontal line drawn through his name, neat and exact. There was no other mark beside it. There was nothing to suggest who had done it. There was nothing to suggest when. My name was in that register too. The false name I had been signing all trip. It had not been crossed out. The line through his name went only through his name. I never saw him at any shelter after that. I checked every register I came across for the rest of my trip. He did not appear in any of them, not as a new entry, not as a crossed-out entry from any previous date. It was as though he had hiked out of the woods on the morning he left the shelter we shared, and then had simply ceased to be a person who logged himself in trail registers, anywhere, ever again. I finished my trip. I drove home. I have hiked many trails since in many states, and I have followed my grandfather's rule on every one of them. I do not give my true name to anyone on a mountain. I do not let it be heard. When I sign a trail register, I sign a name that is not mine, and I keep a list at home of the names I have used and where I have used them, and I burn the list once a year on the 1st of January in my wood stove. I am 59 years old now. I do not know whether the old woman is still on that log. I do not know whether she ever moved from it. I do not know whether the young man whose name she took ever made it home, or whether he made it home as the same person he had been before he answered her. I only know what my grandfather knew, which is that on certain mountains there are certain things that ask for your name, and that the asking is not casual, and that the giving is not free, and that the small and reasonable courtesy of telling a stranger who you are is a courtesy that some of us cannot afford. I am a retired park ranger. I spent 31 years in the federal forest system, the first 11 in the Monongahela in West Virginia, and the last 20 in the George Washington and Jefferson in Virginia, and in that time, I saw most of what there is to see in those woods, the good and the bad and the merely strange. And I filed honest reports on almost all of it. There is one thing I never put in any official report. I never told my supervisors, I never told my wife, and I never told the few colleagues I trusted most, because the telling of it would not have ended well for me. It would have cost me my pension at the very least, and possibly my reputation at the worst. And in those years I needed both, because I had a daughter going through college and a mortgage on a house I could not have sold quickly. I am 73 years old now. I have been retired for 13 years. My wife has been gone for 4 of them, and my daughter is grown and has children of her own, and the pension has been paid out and cannot be taken back, and the house is paid off, and there is nothing left in my life that the telling of this story can damage. So I am going to tell it. There is a maintenance cabin on a ridge in the Jefferson, about 9 miles from the nearest paved road, that the Forest Service used in those years as a remote check-in point. Hikers on the longer backcountry routes would stop in to sign the book, drink water from the rain barrel, take shelter in bad weather. It was not staffed. It was a single room, 12 by 16, with a wood stove and a built-in bunk and a small table by the window, and on the table was a visitor's log, going back to 1962, the year the cabin had been built. The log was a series of bound notebooks, each one filled and replaced when there was no more room, and the older ones were stacked on a shelf above the table, going all the way back to the original. Hikers would sign their name and the date, and sometimes leave a note. Weather observations, trail conditions, the occasional drawing of a bird or a sunrise. It was a record of the human passage through that part of the forest, and most of it was perfectly ordinary, and I would not be telling you any of this if all of it had been an ordinary. But every 7 years, on the autumn equinox, a single entry would appear in the current book that nobody had put there. I want to describe what those entries looked like, because the look of them is the thing I want you to hold in your mind. The handwriting was always the same. It was a precise, careful hand, the letters small and tight, the ink black, the lines straight, even though the page was not ruled in the places the entry appeared. There was never a date written above the entry. There was never a signature. There was only a list of names, written one per line in a clean vertical column, usually 5 names, sometimes as many as 7. Below the list, at the bottom of the column, was a single word in a language that none of us could ever identify. It was not English. It was not any of the European languages any of us recognized. It was a short word, 4 or 5 letters, with diacritical marks above 2 of the letters that none of us could place. I copied it down once on a separate piece of paper, and I carried it in my wallet for a year and showed it to anyone I met who looked like they might know languages. And not one of them could tell me what it was. A folklorist I met at a conference in Charlottesville said it looked like something that might be related to a very old form of Welsh, but he could not be sure, and he did not know what it would mean if it were. I first saw one of these entries in 1983, my second year at the Jefferson, when the old ranger who had been showing me the cabin pointed it out in the most recent book. He pointed to it the way you might point to a stain on a wall, with a kind of resigned tiredness, and he said, "That one shows up every so often, and we do not know who does it, and we have stopped trying to figure it out." He said the dates of the entries were the autumn equinoxes of 1962, 1969, 1976, and the most recent one, 1983, which had appeared in the book the previous week, 3 days after the equinox itself, in a span of time when the cabin had been locked and unvisited, he said. The names in the entries never matched any name we had on file as a registered visitor, he said. The names did not appear to be names of anyone the Forest Service had ever had reason to interact with. He said the older rangers had been talking about it for as long as he had been there, and that nobody had ever been able to figure out who was writing in the book or how they were getting into the cabin, and that the entries did not seem to do any harm, and that I was to leave the entries alone, not erase them, not deface them, just let them sit in the book where they had been put. I did not pay it much mind in those early years. I will be honest about that. I was busy. I was learning the job. The cabin was one of many points on my circuit, and the visitor's log was one of many small administrative things I checked when I was there. I noted the 1983 entry in my mental file of strange things, and I went on with my life. It was the entry of 1990 that made me start paying attention. I was at the cabin 2 weeks after the autumn equinox that year, on a routine visit, and I opened the log to sign it myself and found the entry on the page facing me. Same handwriting, 5 names this time, same word at the bottom. I was standing there reading it when I realized I recognized one of the names. His name was William Ashbrook. He was a young man, 23 years old, who had hiked into the Jefferson on a solo trip in the first week of October that year, 3 weeks after the equinox. He had been reported missing by his family when he had not come out at the expected time. The search had been a substantial one, with our office coordinating the ground teams and a state police helicopter overhead, and we had not found him. We had not found any sign of him. He had simply gone into the woods and not come out, and after 3 weeks, the active search had been wound down, and he had been entered into the federal database as a missing person presumed dead. His name was on the page in front of me, in the handwriting that was not anyone's handwriting, in an entry that had been made before he had gone missing. I sat down on the bunk, and I read the 4 other names in the entry. I did not recognize any of them then. I copied them all down. I drove back to the office that evening, and I ran them through every database I had access to, and what I found over the next several weeks made me cold in a way I have never gotten over. All 4 of the other names belonged to people who had gone missing within 90 days of the entry being made. 2 of them had been hikers in other parts of the country, one in Virginia and one in North Carolina, who had not come out of the woods. One of them was a woman who had disappeared from a small town in West Virginia, last seen leaving a grocery store. One of them was a man who had vanished from a campground in Tennessee. All 4 cases were active. None of them had been solved. None of the 4 were ever found. I went back to the older books on the shelf. I read every entry of that handwriting, going back to 1962. I copied the names down. Then I spent 3 months, in my own time, on weekends, with my wife thinking I was working on a fishing project, running every one of those names through every database I could find. The pattern was the same in every year. Each entry was a list of people who had gone missing within 90 days of the equinox in which the entry had appeared. Sometimes the disappearances had been widely reported. Sometimes they had not. In some cases, the missing person had been found dead later, in circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. In most cases, they had simply never been found. The earliest entry in 1962 had listed 5 names. By the time I traced those names, in 1990, all 5 had been missing for 28 years, and all 5 files were still officially open in the jurisdictions where they had been filed. The book was a list of people who were going to disappear. It was written before they did, and it was written in a cabin that nobody had a key to except the Forest Service. I tried to share my findings with my supervisor in 1991. He was a good man, careful, not given to flights of fancy, and he listened to me for about 10 minutes before he held up his hand and asked me to stop. He told me very kindly that he believed I believed what I was telling him. He told me also very kindly that he would not be passing my observations up the chain, because if I tried to pass them up myself, the most likely outcome was that I would be quietly transferred to a less demanding posting, and the second most likely outcome was that I would be encouraged to take an early retirement. He said the entries had been a known curiosity for 30 years, and that the agency had no interest in investigating them. He said the missing person data I had collected was, in his words, the kind of pattern that the human brain is very good at finding, even when no pattern is there. He said he was telling me this for my own protection, and that I should put my notes away and not bring this up again. I put the notes away. I did not bring it up again. But in 1997, 3 of us, myself, and 2 other rangers I had quietly read into the situation over the years, decided to test something. The equinox that year fell on a Tuesday. On the Monday before, the 3 of us drove up to the cabin together. We inspected the building carefully, the single door, the 4 windows, the chimney. We checked that no entries had been made in the book that day. We locked the door with the standard Forest Service padlock. We then sealed the door with heavy duct tape, 2 long strips that ran from the door across the jamb on both sides, and we sealed each window with the same tape, and we signed our names across the tape with a permanent marker, so that any breaking of the seal would tear our signatures. We went home. We came back together at dawn on Wednesday, the day after the equinox. The tape was intact. The signatures across it were undisturbed. The padlock was still locked. We unlocked the door. We went inside. The cabin was exactly as we had left it. The book was on the table where we had left it. We opened it. There was a new entry on the next blank page. 5 names, the same precise hand, the same word at the bottom. The ink, when one of us touched it with a fingertip, was perfectly dry, as though it had been there for hours, though we had been at the cabin within 12 hours of the equinox itself. We sat in that cabin together for a long time. We did not speak much. We copied the names. We went home. Over the next 90 days we tracked the names, and every one of them disappeared. Everyone. A teenage boy in Pennsylvania, a retired woman in Ohio, a truck driver in Kentucky, a college student in North Carolina, a man my own age in Southwest Virginia. None of them had any apparent connection to each other, to us, or to the forest. None of them were ever found. The 5th name went missing on the 83rd day after the equinox, and that night the 3 of us got drunk together in one of our houses, and we agreed without ever saying so out loud that we would never speak about the cabin and the book again. I retired in 2010. The year I retired, I made one last visit to the cabin, alone, in late September, 3 days after that year's autumn equinox. The entry was there, in the new book that had replaced the one I had first read in 1983. 7 names this time, the most I had ever seen in a single entry. My name was the 5th one on the list. I am going to tell you what I did, because I am going to tell you the whole truth, and you can think of me what you will. I took out my pocket knife. I cut the page out of the book, slowly, carefully, along the binding, so that no edge of the missing page would be visible. I folded the page and I put it in my coat pocket. I closed the book, and I left the cabin, and I locked the door behind me, and I drove home. I burned the page that night in my wood stove. I watched out curl and blacken and turn to ash. I did not tell my wife. I did not tell anyone. I am 73 years old now. I have outlived the 90-day window by 13 years. None of the other 6 names on that page, when I traced them in the months after, ever surfaced as missing persons. I do not know what to make of that. I do not know whether I was supposed to be on the list and removed myself, or whether the list was not what I had always thought it was, or whether burning the page did something that I am not able to understand. I only know that every autumn, in the 3rd week of September, I do not sleep on the night of the equinox. I sit up in my chair in the living room with the lights on, and I watch the clock pass through midnight, and I think about a cabin 9 miles from a paved road on a ridge in Virginia, with a small table by the window and a book on the table. And I think about the hand that has been writing in that book for 64 years now, and I wonder whether it is still writing, and I wonder if my removing my own name only meant that somebody else had to be added in my place. And I wonder, on the worst of those nights, whose hand it is that holds the pen, and whether the hand has ever belonged to anyone who was once, like me, alive.